In this video, we'll be looking at identifying test conditions, right, and test basis, designing test cases, right. Yeah, how do we identify test conditions? Uh, how do we design test cases? So this is what we'll be discussing in this video. So, I mean, it all starts with analysis, right? It starts with test analysis. This is simply the process of, identifying or looking at something that, you can use to derive some test information, right? So, I mean, when you have an app you want to test and you have some information about the app, right? Either through a documentation, somebody told you about the app, and of course you want to test it. You analyze all the information you've been given about the system, right? And you can use that as a basis for your test, right? And use that information as a basis for your test. Sometimes they can give you engineering documents like, system architecture, SRS, or BRS, system requirement documents. The content of these documents can form the basis for your test, right? It's also called test basis. Sometimes user experience can form the basis for your test too. If you have someone who has been very experienced in handling that system, using that system, that can form a basis for a test also. Because your test, the valid test has to be based on something, right? It has to be based on some information. So you can use that base to identify test conditions, right? You can use it to identify test scenarios, right? A test basis is just basically, um, what your test is based on, right? The information your test is based on, because that is your test basis, right? So from the test basis, of course, we are going to identify a couple of scenarios we're going to identify a lot of scenarios that you can use to run the test. And of course, a good thing when identifying scenarios is that you want to be as verbose as possible. You want to cast your net as wide as possible so that you can be able to cover a lot of ground, right? Even though it's technically impossible to test everything in the system, we want to try and cover as much as humanly possible, right? So so yeah, for example, let's say you have an app, right, that does quite a number of things, right? You want to test the login module, right? It's a good thing to think about all the ways you can test a login module. I mean, not just from documentation or from existing knowledge of the app, but from, a wider perspective, even as a user, right? Think of all the best ways you can work with a login module, a login system, right? Identify scenarios whereby you try to log in with, username or password, try to log in with a slow internet connection, stuff like that. All these are scenarios, right? So that you can base your test off on, right? So, of course, you need some intelligent processes or thought process to think of scenarios or to design test scenarios. You want to be able to think deeply. It's kind of a creative process if you look at it, because you're thinking of creative ways to run your test, right? To verify that that system works as expected, right? Of course, if you are given some documentation, it's expected that some of these functions will be documented, But again, as a QA, you need to think beyond what is even written down in your documentation, right? There might be some edge cases that might not have been thought of when the documentation was written, and might need to just expand your thought process a little to to be able to capture those scenarios, right? Of course, then the test conditions that are chosen, will depend on the test strategy, right? The test strategy that has been outlined for your test. Um, so so it might be based on risk. Your test conditions might be based on risk, right? Mitigating risk. It might be based on the model of the system, likely failures, what is likely to fail, right? In that system, might be based on compliance requirements, right? Testing to be sure that the system is compliant with certain guidelines, and it might be based on expert advice also. And it's based on expert advice or heuristics, right? So so test conditions, of course, should be able to be linked back to their test basis, right? Yeah, they should be traceable to their test basis, right? So it should be traceable to either test case, expert advice, documentation, etc. So your test conditions should definitely be traceable to the test basis that's a given. Um, test conditions can be identified for test data as well, right? And for inputs and test outcome. And of course, when you want to run a test, you're expecting something. You're expecting the app to do something, right? You're expecting the app to respond in a certain way, right? And that is called expected outcome, right? So you test with an input and you expect a certain outcome, right? So test conditions can be identified for test data, and you know the test data should be designed to represent most of the important types of data, right? That is the most important, like data conditions. So that's it for test conditions. So I mean, your test conditions will also uh, contribute in the kind of test cases you write. Test conditions you identify can also influence kind of test cases you generate. So that's why it's very important to think carefully when thinking about test conditions for any system that you're working on or you're testing. Yeah. So so that's it for identifying test conditions and test data, test strategy. I'll see you in the next video.